We've been looking quite a lot recently at RxJS observables in Angular, and as we've developed our application, we've seen things can start to get quite complicated when you've got your observables, you've got your operators and things like that. And so a very important technique we have to help us understand observables are what are known as marble diagrams. So they're diagrams that actually represent what's going on with these observables. And so what I've got here is a fairly simple application. You can see on the browser here, we've just got a couple of buttons, one called Start and one called Fire. And if we take a look at the code for this, then we can see that in the HTML, there you can see we've got those couple of buttons and then this output binding where we're going to display some results. And then if we look at the code itself, you can see that the Fire button is actually used to create an observable. We've called it event observable, and we set it up with this from event, which again we looked at in the earlier video, and so it's going to fire every time we do a click on that button. And then you can see we also have a map in here to convert that into just subsequent letters of the alphabet, so it should come out A, B, C and D. And then we've also got the start button, and all that does is subscribes to the observable that we've got here and then just concatenates on the end of the results, so we get the output growing. We don't just see the latest value, we see each ongoing value. And so what I can do here is basically, if I have this observable that we're going to subscribe to and then just plug into that the event observable, so I could say this dot observable dollar equals this dot event observable dollar, so that's hooked it up. Save that, and now if I go back to the browser and click start, that means we start subscribing. And now every time I click fire, you can see we're looking at that observable from the event on the button, and it just gives us a subsequent letter of the alphabet. So that's the basic setup, and we'll be showing lots of different observables and behaviors in there. But now let's start thinking about these diagrams. And so what I'm going to do, in fact, go back to something very, very simple. Rather than for now using that event observable, we're just going to use the of, which remember simply allows us to create an observable with a fixed number of elements. So I'm just going to go of 1, 2, 3, 4. And so you can imagine if we just look at that, I click start and we just get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 coming out. But if we wanted to express that in terms of one of these marble diagrams, it would look like this. So you can see that we've got a line flowing from left to right representing the forward direction of time as the observable progresses. And then you can see we've got these marbles, which are where the diagrams get the name from, indicating each one of the values that the observable is going to emit. So we've got the 5 of them there, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the subtle thing to notice about this particular diagram is that this is a diagram for an observable which terminates. So it goes through 0 to 4 and then just stops. And that's indicated that it's terminating by that little vertical line on the right across the main horizontal line, and that's what's showing us that this terminates. On the other hand, if I were to switch to something different, so if I were to go rather than of, if I were to say have interval, which remember gives us a repeating timeout, so I'll do that at 500 milliseconds, half a second, and then save that one. Then when we click start, it immediately starts going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but then it carries on, and that's not going to terminate at all. And so if we were to look at that on a marble diagram, we'd still have those marbles indicating the numbers and the sequence that they come in, but we don't have that vertical line because this one is not terminating. And when it comes to a marble diagram like that, it's up to us to decide how much information we want to put in there. Obviously, you couldn't put every value in, so it's perfectly possible, actually, that we could just put in those values 0 to 4 as an example. And if we did that and compared the marble diagram for the interval with the marble diagram for the of, they would look almost exactly the same, just 0 through to 4. But that's where that indication of whether it terminates or not becomes very important, because that's telling us about extremely different behaviour between the two that we've got. One other thing to mention when we're looking at the interval is that although we're saying time flows from left to right, there is no real fixed scale of time. So we're not really having anything to indicate that it's 500 milliseconds between each of those, or even that it's a fixed equal amount of time. Because again, if we go back and change this back to using the event observable, then the diagram would still just typically space those out evenly, even though the time between them is going to depend on exactly when I click the button. So we've got a direction of time, we've got a definite ordering of what's going on there, but no real fixed scale. There's one other way that we can indicate the termination of an observable, and that is if the observable ends with an error. And the way we indicate that is simply putting a cross through the line at the point where it terminates. So the vertical line indicates normal termination, but if for some reason we had an error, that would be a cross. And again, we can show that fairly easily. What I'll do on this event observable, let's do a tap. So remember, tap doesn't change the event stream, but it can do some other side effect. And we'll put L for letter, and then we'll just say if the letter is, let's say, E, then we'll just throw and just a piece of text, so let's go eek. And so now if we save that and I start that and then start clicking fire, A, B, C, D, but then when we hit E, nothing happens. And indeed, if we bring up the console, we can see it's reported that exception to the console. We could, of course, handle that in a slightly more elegant way. So if I just uncomment that, so just before we subscribe, we've got a catch error, which will actually catch the exception and then insert some output to terminate the observable. And if we do that, we'll just see it behave slightly differently. So now we still terminate at E, but rather than it throwing the exception all the way up to the browser console, we've handled it in a particular way. So that would just end with the cross at the end of the observable line on the marble diagram. So let's now have a look at some other things. Let's look at some simple ones that we've seen before, some operators, things like, let's start with map. So if I just go into here, then I could, on here, on the observable, I could change this to say interval, and again, 500 milliseconds, but now I'm going to do a pipe, and let's map that so that n for number gives 100 plus n. So very simple. Hopefully, if you've seen the earlier videos, that's easy enough to understand without a diagram, because we know all that's going to do is just give us 100, 101, 102. But if we wanted to represent that map on a marble diagram, we'd do it like this. We'd have the first row, which was the incoming observable, that was just the number 0, 1, 2, etc. And then we say map and give the explanation of that. And then we've got another observable, the outcoming, which is 100, 101, etc. So pretty simple idea of what we can do there. Another thing we can do, remember, is we can do a filter. So we could show how that one works. So we'd say filter, and then we could say n remainder 3 equals 0. So that one's only going to give us every third item. And again, how that works is obviously enough. We get 0, 3, 6, etc. And again, we could represent that on the marble diagram with the two rows. We show the incoming, we show the operation, and then we show the outgoing. Again, questionable whether that's really useful enough to bother with the diagram, but if somebody doesn't understand it because they're new to all this, that's a great way to show them what's going on. Let's look at some slightly more complicated things now. So another operation that I find quite useful is a thing called merge. And merge is useful when you have two observables, both of which can be doing things, and we want to pipe them basically together into a single stream. So whichever one has some new data, that new data gets sent off. And we do this by saying merge, and then we would put in, let's say, our interval again. So we'll stick with the same interval we had before, and then we'll merge that with our event observable. So pop that in there. And so now if I save that and go back there and start it, we can see we're getting through the ones on the interval. But if I click fire, we can see, remember, that's sending off letters, and so we get a letter inserted at that particular point. So the two separate observables have just been merged into one. And this is where I think the diagrams start to become quite useful, because if we consider that one, we can now show the two originating observables, the one with the numbers and the one with the letters, and we then show that it's a merge operation and then show the output where they are getting mixed together. And this is where, although we don't have this fixed idea of time along the observable, we do have ordering, and that's important, because if you look at the ways that the spacing between the items is. So it goes on this diagram 0, 1, 2, 3, and then if you go down vertically, you can see that's where we get the A from the event. Then we've got 4, 5, 6, then we've got the B, and so those just get squished together, and that ordering is what comes out in the merged observable. So it's important that on the diagram, although the actual distances don't matter, the order should still make sense. Okay, similar one to merge is one called concat. So concat is short for concatenate. So let's go there and let's put a concat on there. And I'm going to change this slightly because I'm not going to have the event observable. I'm going to have my interval, and I'm also going to have an of, and then let's do this of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, say. And so what that's going to do when we run it is this. When I click start, we get through the 10, 12, 13, 14. That was the first one of the concatenated ones. And then we get the other one concatenated on the end. So it just takes the contents of the first one and then follows it with the contents of the second one. And we can see, obviously, because the second one is the interval, doesn't terminate, it carries on. And that's an important thing to bear in mind about concat, because if we did this the other way round, then the problem would be that because the first one of them never terminates, the second one isn't going to get called at all. So now we'll see that when we start that, we get the interval counting off, but because the interval never terminates, we never get anything else. So you need to be a bit careful with concat that the first one is going to have to be something that terminates. The second one may or may not be. But again, if we want that on a diagram, we can have the two observables. So we've got the of first and then we've got the interval second. And we can see very simply, we've just got the interval put on the end of the of. So that's how that works. But we can see it now starts to be important whether things terminate or not, because it can, with certain operators like concat, have a big difference on their behaviour. Now, the last area I want to look at is where these diagrams start to get really quite interesting, and this is the area where I find, as a reasonably experienced programmer in this area, I start to make most use of them. These are the ones that I find it hardest to get my head around. And this is when we have observables of observables. So let's go back to the code and let's start putting that together. So what I'm going to do is in here, I'm going to declare this thing I'm going to call obs of obs. So an observable that's not an observable of numbers or an observable of strings is going to be observable of observables of something else. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with my click. So I'm going to take my event observable and then I'm going to do a pipe on that, and then in the pipe I'm going to do a map, and this is where we get the observable of observables, because what I'm going to do in here, I'm going to take my letter, which remember is coming out of the event, it just goes A, B, C, D, and then I'm going to say return, and then I'm going to use of and the one that we've seen before, and then I'm going to pipe that. So what we actually get out is going to be a map of the number that we're getting from that of, and then we're going to combine that with the letter that we're getting from the original observable. And so I'm going to do that. I'm just going to put in the letter first and then the number. So some way or other, this is going to come out as A0, A1, A2, and then maybe when I click a second time, B0, B1, B2, and that sort of thing. So it's quite complicated. As soon as you get observables of observables, you've got all sorts of ways they can combine. Before we actually make any use of that, let's have a look at that on a marble diagram, because this is where it gets quite exciting. Because we've got the observable, which we still draw as the horizontal line going across the page, but then the inner observables we draw as these diagonal observables coming off there. So you can see what we've got there is our first inner observable that goes A0, A1, A2, A3, and then we've got the next one that's going B0, B1, B2, and C0 and so on and so forth. Again, we don't put it all in there, but just enough so we can understand what's going on. But then the other thing to bear in mind about this diagram is we still have the important concept of ordering. So if you say compare the position of the B0 on the second of the inner observables with the A3 and the A4 on the first one, you can see that if you just look vertically downwards, the B0 is falling between the A3 and the A4. And that's important because depending on exactly how we process it, that's going to have an effect on the output we have. And in fact, let's go for the simplest way we can put this output together. So remember, we're not doing anything with that observable yet. So what we're going to do is on here, I'm going to say that the observable we display, the one we're subscribing to, is going to be obs of obs dot pipe. And then I'm going to use what's known as merge all. And so we saw a merge earlier on. This is going to be a merge all, and what it's going to do is basically flatten, and in fact sometimes this process is called flattening, all of those observables. So if you just imagine we squished everything down, so we've now got a single observable of the pairs of letters and numbers, then they'd merge together, and that's why this ordering is so important, because we would see in that case that B0 in the merge would end up between A3 and A4. And so we can see that if we now save that and display the results, and I click start, nothing happens at the moment because remember the initial observable is our click event, but if I click on fire, then we can see that what's happened is it's simply merged all of those and just given us A1, A2, A3, A4. If I fire again, then you can see it gives us the Bs and that sort of thing. So in that particular case, because it used of, which meant that the of exhausts instantaneously, we're not really getting the merge doing very much. In fact, that would behave in the same sort of way if I change this one to a concat all and start that and then click fire, we actually get the same result. But if I were to switch this, so in here, instead of using the of, we're using the interval, and change this one back to the merge, then what happens now is we've got all of those, but then if I click fire again, you can see it's now started again, and that B0 that you can see moving along has gone in between, and now it's just merging all of those together. Just refresh that and start again. So I start that, I fire there, but then if I fire there, we start off a second sequence that's intermingled, so we've got B's and A's mixing together. If I fire again, we've now got B's and A's and C's all merging together. So that's how that merge works. And if we look at that in the diagram, we can see it looks like this. So again, this flattening process, and they get intermingled. If we did a concat all with that one, we'd have the same problem that we had with the concat earlier, in that because it never terminates, so if I click start and fire, we get this non-terminating observable, and so firing again doesn't really do anything because it's waiting for the first one to finish before it can concat onto the end of it. And so when you're doing a concat, that's only really going to work with something that terminates like we had previously of our of. And the diagram for that would look something like this. So we can see that it doesn't matter about that interleaving because they are terminating observables on the diagonals, and therefore they will just get concatenated together. The third one of these related, and it's the last one we're going to look at, is we can do a thing called switch all. And switch all is really quite a powerful one. And if you use this wrongly, and I have, then you can make mistakes. And we'll see why. Because what happens here is, if we look at the diagram, so we've still got those diagonals, we've still got the interval, so the diagonal observables are not terminating. We can still see the ordering that things going. But if I now run that one and click start, and then I click fire, so we get the A0, the A1, the A2, the A3. Now if I click fire again, we're now just getting the B's. So merge carried on with the A's and interleaved the B's. But with the switch all, it's saying switch away from whichever one you had previously and put a new one in. So if I do that again, I fire, I get the A's, and then I just get the B's, and then I just get the C's, and so on and so forth. So if you look at that on the diagram, similar startup to what we had with the merge all, but now, rather than them interleaving, we can see that as soon as we get the first B, all the A's are terminated. As soon as we get the first C, the B's are terminated. Okay, now there's so many more operations that we could have a look at with these marble diagrams, but I think you can see when it starts to get on these merges and these switches, they really can give a good understanding of what's going on. So I'm not going to go through absolutely everything there is, but in future videos, if anything comes up that I think can be made clearer from a marble diagram, then at least we know what they're all about and I can make use of them. So I hope you enjoyed that. Next time we're going to be looking at how you can actually use observables to consume signal R, so bringing together a couple of things we've been looking at recently. But if you did enjoy that, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.